Hi. I am really, really happy to be here, I must say. But truth be told, I'm happy to be anywhere. And if I really have to be quite candid, I'm really extremely grateful to be alive. And that's why I'm especially happy to be here, to be present, because almost 15 years ago, I was dead. And I don't mean that metaphorically, I don't mean that as a figure of speech, I mean that in the clinical sense. Heart-stopping, asystolic, what the doctors call asystolic, for over an hour and 15 minutes. And that's a real eye-opener, to be dead for that long. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that near-death experience, the power of transformation that could come from that, addiction, which is part of the interweaving dynamic, because we've heard a lot today about purpose. And I can talk to you a little bit about the lack of meaning and purpose in one's life and what that might lead to. And also, I also want to touch upon what I see today as probably the most insidious and pervasive addiction affecting a whole generation, and that's technology. So when I began to understand this idea of purpose, the first person that I became aware of that really spoke so really wonderfully in my mind was Viktor Frankl. And some of you may be aware of Viktor Frankl's seminal work, Man's Search for Meaning, which interestingly was originally titled, when he wrote it in 1946, Man's Search for Meaning, the original title was In Spite of Everything, Choose Life. And so those of you who aren't familiar with Viktor Frankl was a 39-year-old psychiatrist from Vienna. A psychiatrist from Vienna, how's that for a shock? But he was a 39-year-old psychiatrist from Vienna who was sent to Auschwitz with his bride, Tilly, who had been married to for about a year at that point, his mother, his brother, and his sister. His mother died in the gas chambers. His brother died in the mines of Auschwitz. His sister did survive and went to Australia, and he also survived. But what he saw out of that, and this is the great work that we learned from Viktor Frankl, is that there was this idea that through the struggle of survival in the concentration camps, that struggle can be a source of meaning for some people, that in that struggle can be life. In that struggle can be a sense of, I will survive, not to quote Gloria Gaynor, but I will survive. And that was a powerful idea that he came away with from his life. And when I first began to get aware of some of Viktor Frankl's work in my own clinical practice and in my own life, I also began to conceptualize a corollary to that. That, yes, struggle can forge one's sense of purpose in one's life. But what if there's not a sense of struggle? What if, in the absence of struggle, how apparent is meaning in one's life? And I began to see that for some people, the struggle is obvious, survival. It's a Maslow's hierarchy of needs thing. Those that have to survive, pay the bills, survive concentration camps. My own father was a 14-year-old boy in a small village in northern Greece that was overrun by Nazi tanks. He had to hide in the mountains as he saw most of the adult males in his village shot and killed. He was 14 years old when he went penniless to Athens and forged a life for himself. For my father, his sense of purpose and meaning was life, live, support my family. My father didn't have time for yoga retreats, self-discovery. It was live and survive. But I've noticed that the children of those who have struggled, and many of us have had parents who survived World War II or the Great Depression or Vietnam, and sometimes there's an ennui that can happen in the younger set. What's my purpose? Mom and Dad, they raised us, they had their purpose, but what's my purpose? And I am, regrettably, or fortunately, one of that generation where my parents struggled so hard to raise and bring their family. I came to the United States when I was 3 years old. We came to New York, and life was a struggle for my father. And in that cauldron of struggle, there's a lot of dysfunction. They didn't have Dr. Spock books. So it's fair to say that I was raised in a fairly dysfunctional family. And I like to call them the Greek Costanzas. Those of you that are familiar with Seinfeld, think of the Costanzas now Greek. And that was what my sort of family was like. So as a young kid growing up in a middle-class, blue-collar part of Queens, I couldn't stand it. I wanted to escape. And my first drug of choice, my first escape, was when I was 7, 8 years old with science fiction. And Star Trek, more specifically. I wanted to be with Captain Kirk to go where no man had gone before. I wanted to be somewhere else other than where I was, because my family was dysfunctional. I didn't like where I lived, and I had a sense of drifting. And I drifted through high school, did well. I took tests well, so I never really got great grades, but I was a good test taker. So I went to the Bronx High School of Science, which was a good school. I got into Cornell, which was a good school. But when I came out, I was drifting. And I tripped and stumbled into a career that was full of addictive potential. It's a long story, but I chanced into a career as a nightclub owner. I started working as a doorman, and within a couple of years, I got involved in a very empty, superficial life that was full of a new kind of escape. Now I didn't need Star Trek anymore. Now I had drugs and alcohol. And so 10 years of that life led me to that near-death experience. Because my near-death experience, my medical reports will tell you that I had a lethal overdose of opiates and stimulants. But I'll tell you that what led to that overdose was emptiness. A life without meaning and a life without purpose. And usually when people hear that I touched the void for so long, everybody sort of wants to ask me, what was it like? What did you see? I had been profoundly interested in what lay on the other side, even as a kid. I used to study about near-death experiences. I was really interested in what lay beyond. Was there a white light, and what did I experience? And I know that we as a culture, from the Eleusinian mysteries to the Egyptian mystery cults, have been profoundly interested in our death, because our death and our conceptualization of death tends to define our lives. What I think may lay beyond tends to really affect how I live my life. And what I'm here to tell you is I didn't have a white light experience, unfortunately, or fortunately. I don't have a memory of a 2-week period from when that happened. I did find out when I learned about Kenneth Ring's work. Kenneth Ring is a psychologist from the University of Connecticut who studied near-death experiences, that less than 20% of people who have had near-death experiences have the classic white light. I didn't have the white light, but I had a profound, I opened up my eyes. You know the first thing that I saw when I opened up my eyes in the cardiac unit at Cornell Presbyterian? I opened up my eyes and I saw Marty King, Larry King's brother. You know, Larry King, Suspenders? His brother was getting a bypass, and he was in the room next to me. And I was totally disoriented. And I opened up my eyes and said, where am I? And there he was, Marty King, who looked like Larry King. And he said, you made it, kid. You made it. And I said, where am I? And he said, you're in the cardiac unit at Cornell Presbyterian. Your ticker stopped. They almost lost you. And I said, oh, surely I'm in some layer of hell I can't believe where I've gotten. But I did feel different. I felt profoundly different, and I had a really, really deep existential thirst when I woke up from that moment. I said I wasn't put on this earth to do what I was doing, and I needed to change my life. And that started a really intensive transformation process where I started just going to the library and reading books about philosophy and religion and the nature of consciousness. And I went back to school, and I realized that purpose was the key. My life had lacked purpose, and for me, purpose also now meant helping other people. And so I started working in psychiatric hospitals, rehabs. I had my own private practice where I dealt with a lot of existential issues. And I realized the sense of purpose was really important, that people who didn't have this were vulnerable to self-destructive tendencies like I was. I saw that in people. Interestingly, I started working with young people at around this time. I started working with teenagers, and I also saw in them this drift, this sense of, I don't know. But what was different than, and that's not new to this generation of teenagers, but what I began to see is this generation of teenagers had access to a powerful drug that my generation and our generation may not have had access to. And I don't want to be a Luddite, but technology was shaping these young people that I was working with. And as a recovering person from addiction, and as a person who treats addiction and teaches the treatment of addiction, I know addiction when I see it. And these kids were addicted to their tech. And I also know ennui and malaise when I see it. And this intersection was happening more and more powerfully. Not just attentional disorders, not just anxiety. The tipping point for me was about 8 years ago. I was working with a young man who was sent to my office because he was acting bizarrely. And he walked into my office and he was blinking and he said, "Where are we?" And he sat down at my desk and I said, "Do you know where you are? Do you know where you are?" And he just kept blinking. And I said, "I'm Dr. Kardaras. Do you know who you are?" And he just said, "Is this?" And he looked at my lamp and he said, "Are we still in the game?" And I said, "No, we're not in the game anymore." He had been playing World of Warcraft for a period of several weeks up until that point and had a gaming-induced psychotic break that required a month-long psychiatric hospitalization and psychotropic meds to get him back in touch with reality. He had gone through the matrix and not known what was real and what wasn't. In my field, they call that derealization. He was also going through depersonalization as well, where he didn't know if he was real anymore. And I began to get really fascinated by that because, again, I'm an addictions expert. I've been through the looking glass, and now I'm seeing it, but now the substance is different. The substance is much more readily available. I had to try hard to get my drugs. These substances were much, much more readily available to our youngest and most vulnerable. And so I started doing research, and the more I found out, the more I discovered that there was more and more research that was showing that screen time was so profoundly affecting the brains of our youngest. And a lot of this research was out there. It was in peer-reviewed literature, but yet it wasn't getting as prominent. And I did a lot of work for school districts, and I was noticing that school districts were all in on tech, iPads for kindergarteners, and meanwhile the research was showing pretty significant things. It was showing frontal cortex damage. I also teach neuropsychology as well, one of the classes that I teach, and I was realizing, and what the researchers were concluding, there were about 7 or 8 studies that were concluding brain gray matter abnormalities and white matter abnormalities in the frontal cortex, in the left striatum, which affects the frontal cortex, as some of you may know, is the decision-making, the executive functioning part of the brain, impulse control, consequential thinking part of the brain that gets affected by addiction. And these same effects were happening in kids that were doing excessive screen time. Dr. Kuhn in Belgium, the University of Indiana Medical School, the Chinese were doing an incredible amount of research on gaming and internet time. The Chinese have identified internet addiction as their #1 health crisis. The Chinese Health Organization has identified 40 million Chinese teens as being internet addicted. Now, we don't have that as an official diagnosis yet in this country. We have it as in the appendix of the DSM-5 is under review. I'm seeing it as the wave of an epidemic that's affecting our youngest and our brightest. What really hit home to me was when I read about an interview. The New York Times, a reporter from the New York Times interviewed Steve Jobs in 2010 at the unveiling of the iPad. And the reporter said to Steve Jobs, tech god Steve Jobs, the man who invented really this wave of technology, "What do your kids think about the iPad?" And Steve Jobs said, "They don't own one. They don't own one." Steve Jobs knows something about tech, and he knows enough to not let his kids have tech. When they interviewed some engineers from Silicon Valley, Yahoo and Google engineers, and they asked them where their kids went to school, their kids went to non-tech Waldorf schools. The people designing the tech, creating the tech, somehow weren't letting their kids get onto tech. So my point is, I'm not a Luddite, I'm not anti-tech. Wait, I'm not anti-tech, I've got a smartphone. But I think my purpose in life now has become to raise awareness about age-inappropriate technology. We're seeing some really powerful effects on our most vulnerable. So I love my smartphone, I love my car, I just don't think my 7-year-old twin should be driving it. And that's really my point, that if we care about this generation, we have to be more thoughtful and engaging with them. And what this generation needs, like we needed, is a sense of purpose, a sense of creativity, a sense of connecting with who they truly are, because those developmental years are key windows of development. And if this powerful drug called tech is intersected in their lives, they may not get to that next developmental stage. I'll conclude it by one interesting study that had come out in 1998 tech, by the way, and it looked at dopamine. So we know that how dopaminergic something is. dopaminergic meaning how dopamine activating, dopamine increasing something is relevant to how addictive something may or may not be. And so in this amazing 1998 study by Cope et al., they found, okay, so baseline level of dopamine is here, and let's say eating chocolate raises dopamine 50%, sexual activity raises dopamine 100%, snorting cocaine raises dopamine levels 350%, and crystal meth raises dopamine 1,200%. They found that 1998 games for teenagers raised dopamine 100%, the same as sex. That 1998 tech was as dopaminergic as sexual activity. Now, my suggestion is we're allowing 7- and 8-year-olds to have access to such dopamine-activating technology. It's just too powerful for them. They don't have the ego strength to just say no. So that's my whole thesis, and that's my whole focus. That's giving my life purpose now, to try to really engage with parents who care and school administrators who care, to raise their awareness to the importance of their kids having purpose and being careful about the tech that they expose their kids to. Thank you.